Hello. Imagine a foreigner trying to drive in one of ASEAN's capitals today using a map or a GPS system that is dated to the 1950s. Now, needless to say, with all the entirely new highways and byways and housing developments, he or she wouldn't get very far. And yet, that is exactly what we are expected to do, many countries today, to maneuver new territories using old maps. My name is Stephen Wong. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of ISIS Malaysia. And my talk today is entitled Old Maps and New Territories. Let me begin with the basics. First, today the most widely used measure of economic growth, of economic well-being is what we call the real gross domestic product, or GDP. It tells us how much we are growing and how much goods and services are actually available to the public. But more and more these days, the GDP figure that governments concoct is somehow disconnected from how people experience it in their everyday lives. Take the D in the GDP. The D in the GDP stands for domestic, which means that basically, unless it happens within the boundaries of a country, it is not counted, or it has no bearing on economic welfare. And yet we know that this is not true. Okay, GDP does not translate down to welfare because of the influences coming from every part of the world. Economies today, in Malaysia is no exception, are more transnational than they've ever been. We still don't live in a completely flat world. It has its imperfections. But Malaysia, already one of the world's most open economies today, relies on trade and investment as it has never done. Now, our economy is increasingly dependent on the outside world, but our measures of how well we are doing are focused internally. This is an old map that we are using to navigate new territories. Second, the GDP that we are talking about today is largely goods. Services are also included, but the services are not well measured because of the difficulty of measuring services. More and more of our welfare today depend on things like services, technology, intellectual property, innovation, even investment. But investment of a different kind from that which we are used to. Not the gross fixed capital formation that is in the accounts and that form part of the GDP, but investments in human resources, in education, in capital. But yet, the amounts that we spend, or that a country spends on human capital, these investments in education, are not taken into account. This is not to say that the fixed asset ratio is not important. It is. We need growing asset per worker ratios because this will spur productivity. But with an economy that is already 50% in the services sector, the gross fixed capital formation is becoming less relevant, not irrelevant, but less relevant. The billions of ringgit that we are pouring into our universities, both at home and abroad, really make for the future of the country. Okay? Today, in most advanced countries, over half of the GDP of the growth or the well-being of the country is contributed by things like software, intellectual capital, brand names, companies, etc. And yet we do not focus on this in our economic plans. If our ambitious plans are come to fruition, therefore, We need to be able to be creators of intellectual property. Today, companies spend billions, small fortunes, all right, on things that have no capital base at all. For example, a software application might contribute 20 to 25 billion US dollars, but yet we do not have the means to incorporate this. We are still dealing with an old map, and while we are venturing into a new territory. Now, this talk is not about keeping better statistics and things of that nature, although this is important. So what do we have to do? It's easy to talk about reinventing government, but we have to understand that government is all about structured processes and procedures. Most times, the same government that we are seeking to reinvent defies change. There are institutional interests, there is institutional capture, there's institutional resistance. In Malaysia, we have tried to accommodate or to adjust for some of this through means of privatization, where we introduce private sector initiative and let the private sector be the one that is bringing together what is required to drive growth. But the private sector's first priority is not economic welfare, it is returns to shareholders. So to be fair, Malaysia has gone some way through privatization, through making adjustments in how government works, but an half-updated map still does not get us to the destination that we want to be. So what do? Let me just quickly reel off 4 or 5 things that we need to do. While if we cannot reinvent government, we can make it better. How do we do it? First, I think all of government, if we are to really update these maps so that we can maneuver in new territories, we need better leaders at the top. We have to start from the top, and the process at the top is not about who is the most experience in terms of processes and procedures, or even government per se, but the person who is most aware of what is going on and can has the leadership ability to drive change within that particular organization. Second, and this is a difficult one, we need a more technocratic government, okay? We need to bring in the specialists. We need to bring in the people who know what drives the new economies, the areas in which we are going. Now, some part of this can be brought by greater exchange from the private sector into government and from government into the private sector. Right now, as it stands, I see there being quite a high wall between the two. If you are one, then you can't be in the other. But in many countries, there is a fluidity, there is change, okay? And this is important. Number 3, we need to fast track those who are able to contribute. Now again, government is all about procedures, and it's all about processes, and it's all about people moving up in step in terms of their seniority. But there is a case for fast-tracking those who maybe by virtue of their skills and their abilities to fast-track them up through the system so that they can be in a position to contribute the most good. Fourth, the processes don't necessarily work unless we flatten the hierarchies. Instead, what seems to be happening not only in this country but in many countries are that we are increasing the number of layers of hierarchies, making it more convoluted, making it more difficult to govern, and to make it more difficult to innovate and to bring about change and to be responsive, in this new environment that we are in. Much of this cannot be addressed simply by taking people and moving them about an old structure. We have to renew that structure, and we do so by flattening the hierarchies. Fifth and last, and probably this is the most important, we need an information-rich society, but we need an information-rich government. What this entails is that we have to stop being so paranoid about information, to be open, and be willing to exchange. Now, at the moment, there is a great deal of consultation that goes on between government and the private sector and society. This we have learned from some of the models that we see in the East. But the people who are the recipients of this information find themselves unable to translate this information and to be responsive to them, either because they do not have the lines of authority, they are waiting for sort of permission from the top, or they don't really understand how this fits into what they do. So, this information-rich governance system, together with an information-rich society, will help to drive the other four proposals that I've put across. We are now in a situation of venturing for the next 10, 20, 30 years in an economic environment that we have not traversed before. We cannot look back to the same planning models, the same things that what we've been doing over the last 10, 20 years and say that that will see us through. We need to update these maps. We need to get a modern global positioning system. We need to have navigational systems, and we need to do it now. Only by doing so can we escape this middle income trap that countries like Malaysia find themselves. Thank you.